up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth.
I truly believe that thoughts are the greatest vehicle to change.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
We do not care whether the cat is black or white, as long as it can catch mice.
Hello and welcome to the No Limitations podcast, a show where we talk to people who have achieved outstanding success in their careers and discovering the influences that have shaped their destinies. I'm your host, Greg Robinson, Managing Partner of Blenheim Partners, Executive Search and Board Advisory Firm. Today I'm joined by Roger Corbett, who has been involved in the retail industry for over 50 years. Roger started his career with Grace Brothers on the loading docks and worked his way up through the ranks. In 1984, Roger joined the board of David Jones as Director of Operations and was appointed on the board of Woolworths and Managing Director of Big W. He later became Chief Operating Officer, then Chief Executive Officer of Woolworths, retiring in 2006. Roger was previously Chairman of Fairfax Limited, Prime Ag Australia, World Food Forum, the Children's Hospital of Westmead, Prince of Wales, Randwick, and the Salvation Army Advisory Board. He has been a director of the boards of the Reserve Bank of Australia and Walmart stores. Roger is currently chairman of Maine Pharma, Australian Leisure and Hospitality Group, Bia Vista, and more recently, Malopo Energy. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Thank you.
Just reading your history there, Roger. I guess you're about 75 years old.
That's right. Spot on.
You've lived your life. Do you think you've been successful?
Well, Greg, I hope I haven't lived all of it. I hope there's a bit left. But when you're 75, you've certainly had the best part of it, haven't you? And yes, I look back and I'm very thankful for lots of things in my life. Most of all for the people that have helped me along the way. If it wasn't for the help that I've received, I wouldn't have enjoyed anywhere near the success and opportunities I've had.
But what's been the main ingredients to success?
I suppose the main ingredients to success has been to have my eye pretty clearly, really from the start, of what success meant. And so for me, success meant protecting my own persona, being true to myself. I am a man of faith, though being true to that faith, and being true to my wife and family. I've been really greatly blessed to have had a wonderful wife and a wonderful family. So I think that protecting that relationship, and then in a type of career sense, having a career that was challenging and interesting along the way, and the opportunity to be able to have an increasingly challenging role, but also to be able to earn sufficient money to be able to provide for your family in the way that you would like to do so, both now and, of course, now I have grandchildren. It goes on. It seems to go on for most of your life. But the great pleasure and blessing of family, I think, is an integral part. It's a part I wouldn't give away for any other part of the career.
And in the combat of work, what's been the real motivation for you?
Well, I suppose, you mentioned my career. The day I started, it took me 25 minutes to get from the reception office, which was near the director's suite, down to the dock where I started. It actually took me 25 years to get back. So it was quite a long journey, but part of that journey was to really do every job in the store from the dock to the director's suite.
So it's a true story. You really did start in the docks.
I did. And it gives me, it type of gives you in your own mind and in the people you deal with an immense amount of credibility, because they all know as you walked around the store, you one day had been a store manager. And when you felt the store manager's shoulder bump you, wanting to turn you in a direction, you knew exactly what he was trying to do because you'd done it many times yourself. So little things like that. But I suppose it really is a credibility of having started at that level and ended up where I was fortunate enough to do. And it's interesting, you can also then be one of the great satisfactions is being the sponsor of other people as people help me to be able to help people develop their own careers, I think is one of the great satisfactions of life.
But Roger, you must have stood out. What were the key things that you thought that someone noticed in you to give you that break?
Well, I decided on the first day when I went home, and my job was actually, it was pre-unloading the trucks in the sense that my job was a storeman that pulled the pallets the lengths of the then Grace Brothers store in Chatswood. And I was only a little guy, and these pallets were very big, and they weren't motivated anyway. They didn't have, you had to move them yourself, and it took a heck of a lot to get them moving and then quite a lot to stop them. I didn't have a good career at stopping them. I had a couple of failures, but, that type of starting point, and then moving on through the various career opportunities. But that day I decided that I didn't see myself moving pallets for the rest of my life. And I made a decision, a very conscious decision, that one day I'd be a director. That was my objective. And along the way, I decided the only way I was going to be a director was to deserve it. And the only way I was going to be able to deserve it was to do whatever level as I was at, to do the job better than anyone else at that level.
And you're one of those persons first to put their hand up to volunteer to take on the new task?
I was up to whatever the opportunity was. But whatever the job was, I realised that whatever it took to be better, hours, effort, application, whatever it was that you needed to do at that job to warrant promotion, that's what you had to do. And that's what I did for 50 years.
What's the cornerstones when things get tough, Roger, and maybe you don't get seen that afternoon, someone else gets promoted above you? I think you've stressed on what I've read about you, it's all around the values and integrity. Is that what's been the foundation for success?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Greg, because there were several times in my life where I was in my view, and probably an objective view, robbed of promotion.
How did you handle it?
Well, I handled it by resorting to my faith and to prayer and sitting down and having a good yarn to my wife.
What did you do about it then?
I just picked myself up and got back to the path and the philosophy of earning the promotion. Whatever you needed to do, I worked to earn the promotion.
And why did you not get the promotion first time round? Do you think the person was better than you? Did you actually stand back and say that? Was it politics? What was on those occasions, Roger?
Well, of course, the point of view of the person suffering is not very objective. And so human nature being as it is, you always think that you've been done a terrible misjustice. That's human nature. But whether you think it's an injustice or not, that's the world. And if you stay in the mindset that I've suffered a terrible injustice, well, that's probably where you stay. You've just got to shake that off and say, well, get on with it. And back to the basic philosophy of doing the job so you deserve promotion.
Okay, so you then get promoted. What type of people did you surround yourself with? I think you mentioned once you like people who maybe been and failed before.
Well, no, failure wasn't necessarily a criteria one way or the other. In fact, if a person had failed, that was in the past. It was what they were doing now and my judgment and their judgment, really, I've got to say their judgment of what their capacity was in the future. I think leadership has got lots of aspects to it. But one of the aspects is to set an environment both of support by education and training and by inspiration and commitment to the people, that you enable them to bring forth the best of what they have to give. And that's a very complex question, but therein lies a nexus, in my view, of successful management and a successful career, because you never, ever achieve something on what you personally do. You achieve it, you being driven and focused and driving is one thing, but you've got to have people alongside you that share the vision, share the commitment, and want to work with you and want to achieve that common goal. So there's the integrity of leadership, that people feel that they can both trust you and believe in the judgment that's ahead. And believing in the judgment means a type of leadership to a combined judgment. So people's opportunity to comment and contribute to that judgment for the future is an enormously important process of achieving that goal.
And when you became chief executive of Woolworths, what did you inherit? What did you find?
Well, I found great opportunity, and I found lots of people around me, both outside and around me, which were an enormous help. For example, Paul Simon, who was an icon in Woolworths, was an immense mentor and help to me. Jack Shoemaker, who had been the president of Walmart and taken Walmart from 30 million to 80 billion, was an immense mentor and friend and help to me. Not to mention the many executives I had working with me in Woolworths, most of whom were outstanding men and women. And, should I also add, an effective relationship with the board of directors. And the board of directors, I think, played an enormous part in the success we enjoyed together at Woolworths. I had the view that if we took a proposal into the board and didn't come out of the room with a better proposal than we went in with, well, then there was something wrong. And so getting this positive interaction between the board and management, it was a very important part of the success of Woolworths.
How did you appoint people? What were you looking for? What were the main characteristics in building the team when you're at Woolworths? You've got the gig, you've worked so long and so hard, like you said. You become chief executive. The board have anointed you and appointed you. You then are up against this big battlefield against you and Coles, or Coles Myer in those days. And it's on for young and old. How are you going to beat them, Roger?
Well, it's interesting you say this, because on one occasion I had an experience. I won't specify exactly where it was because it's not necessary. But the chairman and I was going into a division, and the chairman and I were of the view that the whole of the management team had to be replaced. And we had nominations in line for those positions. And I was going to go in, take over, and the first thing I was going to say is thank you very much and goodbye to the management team. I sat down and talked to them. And as I was talking to them, I thought, I think we're entirely wrong. And I went back to the chairman and said, I'm not getting rid of one of them. Not one of them. He said, are you sure? I said, I am. And that team turned around that business, and it turned it from being a loser business into being the leading business in its sector. And it was just creating the right environment around those executives that allowed them to exhibit and execute their capabilities. And so what did I look for? I looked for people who were committed to the task. I looked for people that had the capabilities necessary to do their tasks. We clearly together agreed upon the common goal that we were going to achieve, and we together worked towards that goal.
And how important is winning to you?
Oh, very important.
Is that what gets you out of bed?
No, winning is equivalent to a part of success, not the whole of success, but a part of success. And it sure beats the alternative, which is losing. So I much prefer winning to losing.
Confidence is everything. The team that you inherited, where was their confidence levels?
Well, it wasn't good when I took over, but I'm delighted to say within a few years it was fantastic and they were winners. And when I look back and look at the men and women who were in that team, I've got to tell you, even to this day, many years later, I look back with the fondest of memories and a real sense of pride of what they achieved.
And is it simple things, Roger, that makes the big change? Like, how do you take a team, as you said, which might have been beaten up, might have been down, maybe lost confidence in their ability, and in comes in Mr. Roger Corbett. It's his first chance of being a chief exec. He's gone and seen the chairman. The chairman said sack everybody else.
No, this wasn't in the role of chief exec. I want to correct that because that would not be right. Well, it's respect and trust and a feeling of empowerment. And by empowerment, I mean that you don't have the right to make a decision if you don't have the right to make a mistake. And so one of the things that's creeping upon our corporate world at the present time is a curtailment of entrepreneurship. So some of the big businesses that I have been in, the executive team are anything but entrepreneurial. They're all about self-protection and self-survival. And they sure don't want to take a risk because the cost of making a mistake could well cost them their job.
Correct.
So in my Woolies days and in my other days, I'd always, if something went wrong, I'd always say, why has this gone wrong? And I'd keep at the why this has gone wrong until someone said, I made a mistake. I called this wrong. The moment they said that, I'd say, fair enough. Okay, we all make mistakes. How are we going to fix it? And what direction are we going to go now? So taking responsibility is one part, but knowing that you can take responsibility, can make a decision, and if it is wrong, then we all make mistakes. So you don't have the right to make a decision if you don't have the right to make a mistake.
So you created the culture which encouraged making mistakes, which is entrepreneurialism in that sense. And one of the big game changers for yourself and during your career was Project Refresh, from what I understand. Who came up with that? How did that come? Was that for the team? Was that Roger? What was the basis for that, Roger?
Well, look, I've got to say everything is always a team. So in that particular case, it was associated with fresh food. And, of course, the defining characteristic of Woolworths at that time was that they were the fresh food people. So the time fresh, the word fresh had an internal type of resonance about it. Yeah. And we were talking about re-engineering the whole of Woolworths and reducing our costs, reducing our selling price and delivering the business to an everyday low price position, which is really the most effective position any retailer can be in. So there's some great examples of that today. Walmart in America is the example, but Bunnings in Australia and Dan Murphy are two of the other examples where people have great confidence in the value that's delivered. So promotional activity to gain customer loyalty is only as good as the guy down the street who runs another promotion tomorrow. Being able to build the credibility in terms of pricing and your position was really the integral part of Project Refresh. So it was it spent billions of dollars in warehouses and systems and so on. But at the end of that thing, it gave Woolworths a very, very significant cost advantage over its major competitor. But it was a whole of house thing. You know, it went from the front door to the back door.
You introduced Project Refresh during a time when the business wasn't broken.
Well, the business needed re-engineering. There's no doubt about that. And the time had come. And this was one of the great opportunities of my life to be there right at that timing when it was needed. And, of course, have had the access to Walmart and other places, which gave me a lot of the technical insights that I needed to have with my colleagues to do what we did.
Roger, when you stand back and look at retail now, and you look at the expenditure to the strategy consultants, the millions that we hear, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, very often, of course, if management don't know what they're doing, they call in consultants and it becomes a crutch. However, there are times when consultants can be enormously helpful when they have a skill set that you don't have in your management team. And in the reorganisation and repositioning of Woolworths, Bain played a very, very valuable time for a part of that process. They were confined. They did what they did outstandingly, and they also deserve some credit for what happened in Woolworths. So it's not a blanket, but more often than not, consultants are overused, and once they get their foot in the door, it's terribly hard to get them out again. And part of their type of business model is to stay as long as they can. And when things stay too long, they begin to get a bit smelly. So you need to move them on.
I guess the other interesting point in the market at the moment, Roger, is all around the Royal Commission, and with that comes maybe a loss. I think you mentioned the word trust is very important in your life and in values. What about corporate Australia? Are the public losing trust in corporate Australia?
Well, look, I think one of the most terrible cancers of life is cynicism. And cynicism creeps on. And if you want to find a sad business, a sad individual, a sad family, or a sad institution, you find one that's full of cynicism.
Yeah.
And it's like a cancer. The opposite is belief, trust, respect, loyalty. And clearly, I think it's fair to say that the superannuation industry and to a degree the banking industry in this country have been driven by people that have taken extraordinary sums of money out of the economy in the guise of management fees. And if you look at what they've delivered for those management fees in terms of the wealth growth of those institutions, it's out of all proportion. And you see people that are in these management groups, equity managing groups and so on, taking enormous management fees. And you look at what's happened to those funds. Many of those funds have not done very well at all. And management fees that come out of a fund, whether it goes up or down, seems to me to have a great deal of a great cause to answer for. And I think that this banking, and now I think even the superannuation sector is worse in my view. I think that this is developing cynicism. And germane in the Australian community is what Keating introduced, and it was a fantastic initiative by Paul Keating and an overwhelming contribution to the life of this country and the contribution to superannuation on our salaries and so on. It's provided an enormous capital base in Australia. It's provided some security for people for the future. But I believe the management of those funds, this current inquiry, and I believe future inquiries will prove has been very poorly done by a lot of people. And the people that need this the most, the people that are that have got their life savings in these superannuation funds, deserve to be able to trust those people to do an outstanding job for them. And I think what's showing at the present time is that the only person that they've done an outstanding job for is themselves.
So it's a question around leadership, isn't it?
It's a question around integrity. So, I would argue that the global financial crisis was largely caused by the structure in America of the major banks, where you had both the chairman and the chief executive in one role. Ineffectively, when you do that effectively, he doesn't report to anyone. He doesn't report to the board. And of course, the avarice of the chief executives of those banks was just enormous. And of course, that was then reflected in their executives, and they became so focused on their own income that there wasn't nearly as much focus on the propriety of what they were doing and the morality of what they were doing. And so some of the things that the banks did in America were terrible. Now, in Australia, we do have the chairman and the chief executive separated, which I think is absolutely vital.
If you were chief executive of a bank, Roger, and on your watch, would there be dead people being charged fees?
Well,
how does that happen?
I'm quite, I would certainly believe the chief executives that I personally know would not have known about that themselves personally, because the answer is, of course, a resounding no. Yeah. However, the question is, Greg, not whether they're charging dead people, but how a system could be in place and the code of ethics and the structure under which people are operated for people to say this shouldn't occur. It should have. The system and the culture and the attitude inside the bank should have prevented this from happening.
So what was your initial reaction when you read it like I did in the Fin Review or the Sydney Morning Herald?
Well, Royal Commissions have a great deal of contribution, and I'm sure the Haynes Royal Commission will have an enormous impact for the benefit on our banks, as did the Wood Royal Commission years ago on our police force. But they have one disadvantage, and that is, of course, the opening presentation of council or whatever it is captures all the highlight and gets all the publicity, and then when the subsequent evidence is given, it may not sustain those positions. You might say, well, if one dead person was charged, that was one too many. That's true, but, I don't think the whole of the banking system is all about charging dead people. I think this was a bad fault, needed to be raised, but I wouldn't say the whole of the banking system is to be implicated through that.
Roger, you're incredibly successful as a chief exec. How did you find the transition into the boardroom?
I think you'd have to ask my fellow directors that, but it is quite hard. In fact, I've, Greg, reflected at length about the effectiveness of boards. And I think a lot of boards are not really effective because the directors opine on whatever they want to opine on. Management often takes little notice and they just go on doing what they were doing. And an individual director doesn't have a great deal of power. He might speak 2 or 3 times during a board meeting. If you spoke too many times, then they'll say Corbett's, dominating everything, or Bill's dominating everything. So you only have so many opportunities to speak. And I think the effectiveness of individual directors on a board is really dependent upon the chairman. And the chairman can make an immense effect on the effectiveness of a board. So let's say a matter comes up and 2 or 3 directors speak on the issue and they might have different points of view, and then the board moves on. Management can select any one of those or something that was in between or whatever the case may be. And having been management, I recognise the opportunity. The chairman really needs to say, now, gentlemen and ladies, we've discussed this. Now, I think the point of view is such and such. Let's minute that, or then let's put that as a matter out of for action, and you type of empower the director enormously. So if you don't have a structure like that, the type of holds the managing director responsible, and in fact uses the board to give the managing director some instructions. I mean on major matters of principle.
Yes.
I don't mean in how to do his daily job.
Yes.
Then your boards are not very effective. And in my experience, not a lot of boards are as directed to doing that as they need to do, and ensuring that the major policy is in position and the managing director is clearly responsible to the board. Any board that I'm chairman of always starts without the managing director in the room. The managing director is responsible to the board, and the board needs to have opportunities to discuss how things are going and his performance. He needs to understand that that's the case. And the board needs to, in areas that it should be dealing with, needs to give clear leadership and clear direction and clear accountabilities.
What were the learnings from Fairfax? There was a business going through tremendous change, Roger. Your name came up a number of times in the press during that transformational change, particularly around the pace of change in technology. What did the board understand about that pace of change? Could they have done better?
Well, at this moment, Greg, you may not have a car in 5 years' time.
Very true.
Because it may be electric, it may be driverless, and Uber technology may mean that instead of having a car that you use for 2 hours a day, you, out of 24, with maybe 2 places to park it that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, you may just use your telephone and walk outside, and a driverless Uber electrically driven car is outside the door.
Which I may share if you're on the way in, Roger.
Well, we might. However, we don't know that. If we knew it, we may not buy another new car. So what is around the corner in technology, we don't fully know. And Fairfax acted at the time in what it saw its best interests. With the knowledge we've got today, would we have acted differently? And the answer is undoubtedly we would have. We wouldn't have sold carsales.com. We would have promoted Domain much earlier. We wouldn't have allowed ourselves to lose the recruitment business. We would have been further ahead. So looking back, I, in company with my colleagues, would have to acknowledge that.
Was that the board's problem in that case, Roger, or was management not prosecuting the case strong enough?
No, you couldn't say it was board or management. It was a collective perception of what the judgments were. And so, for example, the editor would always be conscious to put the newspaper together, because that's what he'd been brought up on. The digital was secondary and less important. But you've got to also understand that there were a number of revolutions that hit the newspaper industry. The first revolution was, of course, that the paper could be delivered digitally.
Yes.
The second revolution was that, of course, the internet and access on screen and telephone to jobs, cars and houses was a better example than buying a great big stack of paper every Saturday and working your way through it. Thirdly was the yield on paper, a page of paper advertising was quite enormous to what was available on a page of digital. And finally, social media has played an enormous part in freely aggregating news and therefore impacting upon the newspaper. So Fairfax was a business where its turnovers were dropping at 15% a year. For it to have continued to survive as long as it has, and then to have, under the recent transaction, delivered the value it has to a number of its stakeholders. So its shareholders, if you put together the value of their shares in Domain and their value of their shares if it proceeds in the Channel 9 Fairfax deal, I think they've done extremely well. If you look at the journalists, today, journalism, to be effective, has got to be delivered through a whole lot of mediums, not just newspapers.
That's right.
And the only way people will be able to afford that will be that it's the cost of producing it is amortised over a whole lot of distribution channels. So the marriage with Channel 9 is, I think, a very good one for the journalist and the community. And, of course, it'll probably enable the newspaper in its newspaper form to continue to be delivered for a long way forward. And I think the interesting thing is the decline in the paper version of the paper has started to stabilise. And that's pretty interesting too. So it's like everything else now, Greg, in the business world, this digital revolution, like the motor car, like Uber, like how you buy your groceries, like how you buy this or that, is on the move. So the two big imponderables, I think, for us looking at the future is a collective impact of digital technology on just about everything we do. And this question, as we type of depart from our traditional values of life, and this question of cynicism creeps in to our society. Those are not happy trends. And it is terribly important, this type of cynicism that exists in so many things, but in politics is such a good example. You've got Trump in the United States.
Just about to ask you about your friend, Mr. Trump.
Well, he's not my friend. If you measure friendship, does he know me? I can assure you it's no friendship at all. I feel I know him pretty well. And what I do get from my many trips to the United States is that there are people that are ardent supporters of Mr. Trump. And there are people who are absolutely embarrassed by Mr. Trump. And never has the twain been wider than it is at the present time. Some of the cynicism. So Mr. Trump plays on fake news. It's playing on cynicism. Mm. And in fact, if you look across the world, the two major trends are the question of migration and the questions associated with that, racial integration and so on.
Nationalism.
Nationalism. So it's really in the race area. So the question of the Spaniards in America and the reaction of some people to that, the question of the great migration of the African continent into Europe and into Britain, and you could look elsewhere at these population migrations, Australia. So that's one element, and it certainly drove Brexit. It certainly put Trump into office. It certainly drove some of the changes in Europe at the present time, in France and Germany. And the other major trend is the inequity of the wealth distribution in the world. So I think I'm right in saying in the last 5 years, 9 out of every $10 of aggregate growth in America has gone to the top 5% of the population. So you go across middle America, looking a bit better now because things are booming, but you go across middle America and it is a very, very poor place. And so this contrast, and one of the things Mr. Trump has done, of course, is promise to America, middle America, a solution to that, which he, of course, cannot deliver.
Oh, Roger, the counter-argument to that is unemployment's declined, confidence is up, black unemployment is at its lowest of all time. They've been successful in dealing with international relations so far, and yet you say you're still very concerned. Is it the cynicism will be there? We've seen the cynicism in our country. Is Mr. Trump all that bad?
Greg, that was off a terribly low base. And I don't think it's got anything to do with Mr. Trump, except the taxation reductions of recent times have been a help. But I think the current strength in the American economy has got little to do with that directly. It's too soon, really, for that to have an impact. It's got to do with, I've got to say, to a degree, Walmart in the United States lifting its basic wage from $6 to $12 with 2.5 million people in the population, I think that was a start to the capitalist, because the recovery in America is being driven by consumer confidence and demand.
Yeah. Where do you see the state of play in Australia?
Well, whenever you get independent parties having the type of sway they've currently got in the Australian Parliament, you get a situation where the major parties cannot take a leadership position. And it is almost impossible for the coalition really to give decisive leadership. Clearly, the taxation proposal at the present time is both modest and should be supported. But the Labor Party can continue to play the government because the government hasn't got the numbers to push it through. Now, whether if the Labor Party was there, they do it, I suspect they might do it along lines. We need a taxation realignment in Australia.
But where's business standing up and arguing the case, Roger?
Well, I think that's
where you hear this over and over, but no one's standing up.
Well, I have to admit, business has been very quiet. And in my view, the ACCC and the Business Council of Australia, it shouldn't be the executive officers of those bodies that are making the comments. It should be the chairman of their boards taking a leadership role. Now, Michael Chaney took a very positive role when he was head of the Business Council of Australia. The current incumbents are really giving no leadership at all. And business should give their leadership, in my view, through the ACCC and the Business Council of Australia. And those people should be of high calibre and should be vocal on behalf of business in Australia.
So why is it so quiet? Is it fear of retribution? What do you think?
I don't know, to be quite honest, but all I know, the result is very clear. It's a deafening silence.
And does it worry you?
Yes, it does.
And does it worry many of your peers?
Well, I think the malaise in addressing some of the critical issues. For example, the critical issue in Australia is one of revenue. We cannot have the National Disability Initiative, the Gonski Report, and the ever-increasing costs of health in this country, those three big-ticket items, without increasing our taxes. And the way to do that, the fairest way to do that is to lift the goods and services tax from 10% to 15%. I'm very disappointed that when Turnbull confronted with that opportunity several years ago, I understand the government had made the decision to proceed. And the opportunity was, you recall, that Mike Baird in New South Wales had given vocal support and set a stage. The then Premier of South Australia, who was really battling with his own budget, started to talk about it. And there was an opportunity evolving that with some precise leadership, good selling. And then there was an opportunity to make a change. We failed to do that. And I think that was a critical point of economic history for Australia. And the Prime Minister very significantly let down Australia by not giving leadership at that time. So important in politics is timing. And when an opportunity comes along to make a decisive move, and many believe that opportunity was there, Prime Minister failed to take it. And I think the whole of his tenure as Prime Minister of Australia will be marked by his failure to do that. If we had done that, I think it would have led to a lot of other further initiatives which would have greatly enhanced our economy.
Are you an optimist or a pessimist now?
I'm an optimist.
What else would you do if you were given the keys to the lodge?
I'd enjoy it, is what I do.
Is there any advice of the Roger today that should be best heard from the Roger of the yesteryear?
Well, there is a Roger of tomorrow, and that's my son called Rob, and my son-in-laws and my daughters and my daughter-in-laws. So that's naturally where my focus is. And I think they would all say, Dad, you spent too much time at work. And I think they're probably right. And so I think I grew up in a family that was very constrained for money at different times. And I suppose I've always had a fear, a deep down fear of not being able to provide for my family. And I've always thought that that's just a step behind me if I don't keep working. So I think that I have maybe at times been over-focused in ensuring the security for my family. And I think at times it has been too costly in terms of time. So how to better get that balance seems to me that you need to constantly rethink and review your concept of what success is and how you define them, and give yourself a little bit of a scorecard almost on a yearly basis of how you're going against those priorities. Because at the end of the day, success will be balancing a number of priorities. And keeping that balance right is something none of us do too well because we get overly focused for often very good reasons. So I think getting that time factor right is so important.
Roger, thank you very much for sharing your insights today and your personal journey. It's been a great show. You've been listening to No Limitations.